economies function best where the government is small, such as in Hong Kong, and where there are no economists. If I look at history of the US, 1800 to today, we had a process of industrialization, mostly in the second half of the 19th century, the time of what the socialists called the robber baron days. They were not robber barons at all. They were building railroads and canals and freight trains and so forth and so on. And they made money with it. And at the same time, the standards of living of ordinary people went up because transportation costs and transportation expenditures went down and transportation became efficient. So you could ship essentially meat from Abilene and Chicago to New York and so forth. And that lifted the standards of living. What have monetary policies done in the 20th century for the standards of living of ordinary people, especially after essentially the 2000 crisis? We had this money printing, and since then real wages have stagnated by and large, and the wealthy people have become wealthier. The financial sector has become bigger and bigger and bigger, but ordinary people, 70% of people now in the US live paycheck to paycheck. That is money printing. And unfortunately, nowadays, there are very few people I'd like to meet, because some people say the Austrians, from the Austrian School of Economics, but then they go and tell countries, well, they should print money or they should intervene there and so forth. For me, that is self-defeating. I'd like to have an economist with a voice that says the government should get out of the economy. Once you have an expanding bureaucracy, say in 1910, no country in the Western world, including the US, Australia, New Zealand, had government expenditures of more than 12% of GDP. And nowadays in Europe, we have systems where the government is 60% of the economy. Once we go over 80%, you can say that we are in a socialist country or in communist country where the government essentially owns and controls everything. We have studies that are non-partisan studies. They show clearly that the larger the government is, the slower economic growth will be. And also there is a saying, the government, the bureaucracy needs to expand in order to control the bureaucracy. It's a cancer that grows and grows and grows. And to bring it down is very difficult. In America, say the government, the mandatory expenditures, in other words, by law, they must meet the social security payments. There's not an option to cut it. And the payments to the veterans and pension payments and Medicare and so forth and so on, that is about 70% of government expenditures. And that cannot be cut. Trump and his advisors tell me they can cut $2 trillion. They would cut essentially everything, including the army. I don't think they can make much difference. And I'd just like to say this. I was a friend of Larry Tisch, who was the founder and was running Lowe's Corporation in America. And his brother, Preston, in the 70s, he became the postmaster general. And his job was essentially to clean up the post office. After 1 year, he resigned. That tells you something. We call it the deep state. Is so entrenched and has so much power, it will be very difficult for Musk and his colleague to do anything. And it will be interesting and volatile. I think the first time I went to Eastern Europe was in 1956, when Yugoslavia was still under Tito, and it was a more moderate form of socialism, communism than, say, Russia. But what was striking at the time was how poor these Eastern European countries were relative to the prosperity we had in Germany and Switzerland and France and so forth, whereby the prosperity at the time in France and other European countries was not as high as in the US, which was a much higher level of prosperity. But unfortunately, young people today in Europe, they haven't seen the disaster that socialism and communism brought about in terms of cultural development and of society's development and of economic growth that we had in Eastern Europe compared to the Western world at the time. I was ski racing for the Swiss ski team, so I went frequently to Eastern European countries, and all these people were very poor. And when communism fell apart, and it began slowly, with the open door policy in China, which was a huge success when China opened up in lifting the standards of living of Chinese people. And then it happened in 1989 in Russia and in Eastern Europe and so forth, and all these standards of living went up. These countries, they never want to go back to socialism and communism. But in the Western world, where young people never experienced the disaster that socialism brought about in terms of society and economic freedom, nowadays, maybe 70% of the people, the young people, want socialism. They always say, oh, the government should do this, the government should do that. The last thing they would say is, I want to do something. That is the difference. And freedom has to be earned. You don't get freedom just like this. You have to fight for it. And you have to take own responsibility. If you are always asked the government should do this and the government should subsidize that and so forth and so on, then the demands of the government upon its citizens will also increase, and then suddenly people have no more freedom. So the key is really, you want to be free, there's a price to be paid for it, and that is hard work and self-reliance, and not reliance on the government and regulations all the time. I'm shocked that in Switzerland, we have in Zurich a socialist government. All my friends are from an affluent society, and I tell them, you should stand up for neutrality of Switzerland. This is the only thing that Switzerland can do for the world, to stay neutral. But no, they want to join the EU. The EU is a complete failure in every respect, and yet they want to join it. Now, I can understand that a country like Georgia in Central Asia wants to join the EU because they have access to trade and they get subsidies and so forth and so on. That makes sense for that country, but not for Switzerland, which has a higher standard of living and higher per capita incomes and capital wealth than the EU. But the rich people, they don't want to expose themselves. Why? Because they're cowards. They are afraid that the socialists will come after them and, ask them about taxes and so forth, the way they ask me. I'm living now for more than 50 years outside Switzerland. I'm 78, past the peak of earnings that I had when I was in the 50s or so. Suddenly I get a letter from the tax office in Zurich. They want to know all the details. If we talk about capital investments, it's not up to the government to say we increase the debt level. It's up to the entrepreneurs and the companies to say we want to invest in Germany. Unfortunately, the socialists, the Greens, and the communists, and all these left-wing organizations that we have, and many are coming from the US, I may add. They want the EU, they want more regulation, and what they achieved is that entrepreneurs in Germany, big companies like Volkswagen, BASF, and Bayer, and so forth, they are closing down factories and moving the factories somewhere else, to America or to China. Germany is a big investor in China. They have a lot to lose if there is a trade war. But it's an absurd idea that the Bundesbank would say, we need more investments. We need to loosen monetary policies to stimulate investments. Investments are driven by returns on capital. If you invest in Germany, how much I'm going to earn? But the German government under the socialists, the latest government is an example. It's hard to believe that in a democracy where you'd think that intelligent people are in the government, the dumbest people are in the government in Germany. They have an intellectual level of Kamala Harris. For me, as an economist and as an observer of geopolitical events, I really don't understand why Western Europe would be unfriendly towards Russia. This beats me. Because economically seen, there is hardly any combination of resources and technology and know-how and vast resources and land masses than Western Europe and Russia. The two together is an enormous economic and political power. But the US wanted to drive a wedge between these two entities. And the result is that now Europe buys more expensive energy, more expensive resources, that trade flows have shifted, and that actually Western Europe comes out weaker and Russia stronger out of the whole conflict. That is the result. Plus, this already geopolitical strategist like Halford Mackinder pointed out, you don't want essentially a landmass that includes essentially it goes from Germany to the Far East, Russia and China, that these countries are all kind of united. I mean, if there was ever a geopolitical mistake, it was the US State Department driving Russia and China into a friendship. But these idiots who sit in Washington, D.C., they have no clue about history. They have no clue about geography. And the worst is this Victoria Nuland that was driving all these policies to essentially create a war, which would include the Western world essentially supporting Ukraine against Russia. If you ask me about the military, I'd say yes, let's combine the military between Western Europe and Russia and be on friendly terms. Putin hasn't done anything bad towards the West. US has done many things bad against everybody in the world. That I can assure you. Western media accuses China of building railroads in Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. Well, better build the railroads than go and carpet bomb these countries. This is the US. And using Agent Orange, you can see the damages today in these countries. And then they accuse China of building railroads. You have to laugh. I mean, the whole world in Asia laughs about the US in this sense.